Welcome back to my channel, HF Coins World. There is a certain kind of coin that gets ignored almost every day in America. It gets dropped into a cup holder, tossed into a cash drawer, forgotten inside an old jar, and eventually mixed with dozens of other quarters. But every once in a while, one of those ordinary-looking coins deserves a second look. Today, we're following Washington quarters from 1965, 1967, and the late 1980s through 1993. And there's one detail that can completely change the way you look at these coins. Not because every old quarter is secretly worth a fortune. It isn't, but because these dates sit inside one of the most interesting transitions in modern U.S. coinage. And if you're checking an old collection, there's a particular reason the 1965 and 1967 quarters deserve your attention. The Washington quarter itself has a remarkable history. The design featuring George Washington began circulating in 1932, created to honor the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth. For decades, the quarter was made with a silver composition. Then came 1965 and everything changed. The U.S. Mint removed silver from the circulating quarter and moved to a copper-nickel-clad composition. That means a 1965 Washington quarter is not automatically a silver quarter simply because it is old. In fact, the normal 1965 issue is clad, with copper-nickel outer layers surrounding a copper center. That small change in composition marked a major moment in American coinage. And here's where the story gets interesting. Imagine finding a 1965 quarter in an old family coin jar. You turn it over, see Washington's familiar portrait, and think it's just a quarter. But then you start wondering, collectors pay attention to some examples more than others. The answer isn't simply the date. It can be the condition, the type of strike, unusual characteristics, and whether the coin is genuinely different from the normal circulation pieces. That's an important lesson in collecting. The date opens the door, but the coin itself tells you whether there's anything worth investigating. Now move forward 2 years to 1967. This was another unusual period. For the mint, the nation was still dealing with the coin shortage of the mid-1960s, and production of circulating coins was enormous. PCGS records a mintage of more than 1.5 billion 1967 Washington quarters. Interestingly, the circulating 1967 quarters were produced without mint marks during this period, which means you shouldn't automatically assume that a 1967 quarter without a D or S is missing something. The absence of a mint mark was intentional. But there's another fascinating part of 1967. The mint also produced special mint set coins. And some of these can look different from ordinary circulation strikes. To an inexperienced eye, the distinction may not be obvious. That's one reason serious collectors don't simply look for a shiny coin and declare it rare. They compare surfaces, strike quality, luster, and other characteristics. A coin can look impressive under a lamp and still be a normal example, while another coin with subtle characteristics may deserve much closer attention. Now let's jump ahead to 1987 through 1993. These quarters are much younger, and that's exactly why some people overlook them. But age alone doesn't determine collector interest. During these years, Washington quarters were still being produced in large numbers, and the challenge for collectors often becomes finding examples in exceptional preservation. Think about what happens to a quarter after it leaves the mint. It gets stacked with thousands of other coins. It gets thrown into pockets. It rubs against keys, counters, vending machines, and other change. Even a tiny mark can affect the appearance of a coin. So imagine 2 quarters from the same year. One has been circulating for years and shows obvious wear. The other somehow stayed in remarkable condition, with strong detail and very few marks. They're technically the same denomination and date, but collectors may view them very differently. That's the psychology behind modern coin collecting. Collectors aren't just asking, how old is it? They're asking, how difficult is it to find this particular coin in this particular condition? This is especially important when people see dramatic prices online. A Washington quarter from one of these years may have a published price for a high grade that looks surprisingly large compared with its 25-cent face value. But that does not mean every example of that date is worth that amount. Professional grade matters enormously. A coin that looks brilliant to someone at home might not receive the grade needed to bring a premium price. And an auction record for an exceptional specimen is not a promise of what an ordinary circulated coin will sell for. Current price guides show just how dramatically values can change across grades. Here's a realistic discovery scenario. Picture someone cleaning out an old dresser and finding a small envelope filled with quarters. There's a 1965, 1967, then several coins from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Instead of immediately searching for the biggest number they can find online, they place the coins on a clean surface and examine them one at a time. The 1965 has normal circulation wear. The 1967 looks unusually sharp. One of the later quarters has a strange mark near the lettering. At that point, the smart move isn't to assume they've discovered a fortune. It's to ask a better question. Is that unusual feature something created at the mint, or is it damage that happened afterward? That distinction matters more than many beginners realize. A scratch from circulation, a hit from another coin, or damage caused by cleaning isn't the same thing as a genuine mint-made error. Sometimes a damaged coin can look incredibly dramatic in a photograph, but experienced collectors know that unusual doesn't automatically mean valuable. The strongest discoveries are the ones that can be supported by evidence. There's also a practical rule worth remembering. Don't clean the coin. If an old Washington quarter looks dark, dirty, or discolored, leave it alone until you know what you're dealing with. Trying to make an old coin look newer can damage the original surface and potentially hurt its collector appeal. Simply handling it carefully by the edges and examining it under good light is a much safer approach. Now, if you're looking at a 1965 quarter, the first thing to remember is that the standard circulating issue is clad, not the traditional 90% silver composition used on earlier Washington quarters. That makes 1965 historically important. But it doesn't make every 1965 quarter rare. For 1967, the lack of a mint mark on circulating coins is normal, and the real collector interest often shifts toward exceptional condition and special issues. For the 1987 to 1993 group, the same basic philosophy applies. Don't just stare at the date and wait for a miracle. Look at the entire coin. Is the design sharply defined? Are the surfaces unusually clean? Are there obvious signs of heavy circulation? Is there a feature that looks like it could have originated during the minting process? And if the coin seems genuinely unusual, compare it with trustworthy references before making any claims about its value. There's something else that makes this period fascinating. These coins aren't ancient artifacts hidden away in museums. They're pieces of everyday American life. A 1965 quarter could have been spent during an era when American coinage was changing dramatically. A 1967 quarter was produced during an enormous push to keep coins moving through the economy. And a quarter from 1987, 1990, or 1993 could have passed through countless hands before eventually ending up in a collection. The history is sitting right there in a tiny piece of metal. And that's why collectors can become fascinated with coins that most people would simply spend. The thrill isn't always about finding something worth thousands of dollars. Sometimes it's finding a coin with a story. Sometimes it's discovering a condition rarity. Sometimes it's identifying a genuine variety or mint-made error. And sometimes after all that searching, you discover that your coin is worth close to face value, but you've learned something about American history that you didn't know yesterday. For collectors in the United States, that accessibility is part of the appeal. Washington quarters are familiar, easy to recognize, and have been part of American commerce for generations. That means you don't need an expensive collection to begin looking. You can start with a handful of coins already sitting in a drawer. The important thing is learning how to separate an ordinary example from a genuinely interesting one. So if you come across a 1965 Washington quarter, remember the silver transition. If you find a 1967, don't be surprised by the missing mint mark on the normal circulating issue. And if you're sorting through quarters from 1987 to 1993, don't dismiss them simply because they're newer. Look at condition, surfaces, mint details, and unusual characteristics before deciding what you have. And there's the bigger lesson. A coin doesn't become valuable because someone put a huge number beside its photograph online. Its value comes from what the coin actually is, how rare that particular version is, its condition, and what collectors are willing to pay for it in the real market. That's why patience beats hype every time. So tonight, take another look at that old jar of quarters. Maybe you'll find nothing unusual. Maybe you'll find a beautifully preserved coin. Maybe you'll discover a detail you've never noticed before. Either way, you've turned ordinary pocket change into a small investigation. And that's where the fun of collecting really begins. This is HF Coins World, where we look beyond the face value and explore the stories hidden inside American coins. If you enjoy these discoveries, subscribe and stay with us for more. And before you spend your next Washington quarter, turn it over, check the date, look closely at the details, and give it one more second. You never know which ordinary-looking coin will make you stop and look twice. First, 1965 Washington quarter. There is a Washington quarter that looks almost exactly like millions of others. Yet the year stamped on it represents one of the biggest turning points in modern American coinage. 1965. If you find one in an old drawer, a family collection, or a forgotten jar of change, don't immediately assume you found a fortune, and don't spend it without taking a closer look either. The real story of this quarter is more interesting than an exaggerated internet price tag. It is the story of a nation running short of coins, rising silver prices, crowded mint facilities, and a decision that permanently changed what Americans carried in their pockets. And there is one surprising detail about the 1965 quarter that many people get completely wrong. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why this ordinary-looking coin matters. To understand 1965, we have to step back a few years. In the early 1960s, silver was still part of everyday American money. Washington quarters were made from a 90% silver alloy, and people could find silver in ordinary circulation without thinking of it as something unusual. A quarter was simply a quarter. You could use it at a store, a parking meter, a vending machine, or anywhere else that accepted change. But behind the scenes, the economics of silver were changing. The price of silver was rising, and the amount of silver contained in American coins was becoming increasingly important. At the same time, the United States was experiencing a serious coin shortage. People were holding on to coins rather than spending them. Collectors were searching for older issues, and the mint was under pressure to produce enough circulating money for a growing economy. By the middle of the decade, the problem had become impossible to ignore. Imagine walking into an American bank in that era and discovering that the supply of quarters and dimes simply wasn't keeping up with demand. Businesses needed change. Banks needed coins. Customers expected to receive quarters as part of ordinary transactions, but the old system was under strain. The government needed a practical answer, and that answer would change the quarter forever. Then came 1965. The Coinage Act of 1965 authorized a major change in the composition of U.S. circulating coins. The traditional silver composition of the dime and quarter was replaced with a clad structure. Instead of being made primarily from silver, the new quarters used outer layers of copper nickel bonded to a copper core. It was more than a technical change. It marked the end of an era in which silver quarters were normal pocket change. And here's the part that causes confusion even today. A normal 1965 Washington quarter is not a 90% silver quarter. That's important. People sometimes see the date and immediately think, 1965, that must be silver. But the standard 1965 Washington quarter is a clad coin. If someone tells you that every 1965 quarter is automatically a rare silver coin, be skeptical. So why does the 1965 quarter attract collectors? Because the coin captures a moment when American money was changing in real time. Think about someone spending a 1965 quarter in a grocery store. They probably didn't stop to study the metal. They didn't know that the quarter represented the beginning of a new era. To them, it was simply 25 cents. Maybe it bought something useful. Maybe it went into a parking meter. Maybe it sat in a child's pocket for a week. Nobody could have known that decades later, collectors would study these coins as evidence of one of the most important transitions in U.S. circulating coinage. The physical appearance of the coin can also tell you something. If you look carefully at the edge of a clad quarter, you can often see the copper-colored core between the outer layers. That edge is one of the easiest ways to distinguish clad construction from the solid-looking edge of older silver issues. Of course, appearance alone shouldn't be used to make a serious authentication decision, but it is a useful first clue. Now, here's another fascinating part of the story. The coin shortage didn't disappear overnight. The mint needed to produce enormous quantities of coins, and the government took extraordinary measures to increase production and discourage practices that made the shortage worse. During this transition, certain circulating coins were produced without the traditional mint marks. The goal was to make coins harder to trace back to a particular facility and reduce the temptation to pull certain issues from circulation for collecting purposes. For the regular 1965 Washington quarter, there is no mint mark. That doesn't mean the coin is defective. It doesn't mean somebody removed a letter. It is normal for the 1965 issue. This is one of those tiny details that can completely change how a new collector looks at the coin. Now let's imagine a different scene. A few decades have passed. An American family is cleaning out an older relative's house. In a small box, they discover a collection of coins that hasn't been touched in years. At the bottom is a 1965 Washington quarter. Someone picks it up, notices the date, and immediately searches the internet. Suddenly, they see huge numbers attached to certain 1965 quarters. Excitement builds. But this is exactly where a collector needs to slow down. The existence of a high-value example does not mean every coin with the same date is valuable. Coin value depends on the specific coin. Its condition matters. Its surfaces matter. Its strike matters. Genuine errors or recognized varieties can matter. And professional grading can make a huge difference when dealing with coins at the higher end of the market. A heavily circulated 1965 quarter with scratches and wear is a completely different proposition from an exceptionally preserved specimen. And an ordinary coin with a post-mint scratch is not suddenly a rare mint error, because the scratch looks unusual under a camera. That's one of the biggest lessons in coin collecting. Unusual does not automatically mean rare. A real mint error happens during the manufacturing process. Damage can happen afterward. The difference may look small to someone who has just started collecting, but experienced collectors pay very close attention to it. This is also why you should never clean a potentially collectible coin. Maybe your 1965 quarter looks dark. Maybe it has some discoloration. Your first instinct might be to polish it until it shines. Don't. Cleaning can alter the original surface and potentially reduce collector desirability. A coin doesn't need to look brand new to be interesting. Instead, handle it carefully by the edges. Use good lighting. Look at the date. Examine Washington's portrait. Study the lettering and the rim. Then inspect the reverse, where the eagle and surrounding details can reveal how well the coin was struck and how much wear it has experienced. And here's something else worth remembering. The 1965 quarter was produced in enormous numbers. That means the date itself is not rare. The interesting question is whether your individual example has something that separates it from the millions of ordinary coins that survive. This is where collector psychology becomes fascinating. Why would someone spend time examining a quarter that most people would happily spend for a snack or drop into a vending machine? Because collectors aren't only buying metal, they're buying scarcity, history, condition, and the story behind the object. A coin that survived decades in exceptional condition can be interesting, precisely because so many other examples were used, scratched, worn, and forgotten. Imagine opening an old album and seeing a 1965 quarter that looks almost untouched. The date is clear, the lettering is sharp, the surfaces have unusually few marks. Suddenly you're no longer looking at just 25 cents. You're looking at a survivor from the exact year American circulating quarters entered a new era. That doesn't guarantee a huge price, but it creates a reason to investigate. And that distinction is important for anyone watching videos about rare coins. Real collecting is not about promising that every old coin will pay your bills. The market is much more complicated. A coin's value can change depending on grade, rarity, demand, certification, and the actual prices buyers are willing to pay. An online listing with a massive asking price is not proof that someone actually paid that amount. For the average 1965 Washington quarter found in circulation, the value is generally modest. Coins in ordinary circulated condition are not automatically worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. The more serious collector interest tends to appear when a coin has exceptional preservation, a legitimate recognized variety or error, or another characteristic that makes it genuinely unusual. So if you find a 1965 quarter, what should you do? First, don't panic. Second, don't clean it. Third, don't trust the biggest number you see online. Look at the coin itself. Check the date. Confirm that the mint mark is absent as expected. Examine the edge. Study the surfaces. If something genuinely unusual appears, compare it with reliable numismatic references, or consider having the coin examined by a qualified professional, because sometimes the most valuable thing you discover isn't a price. It's the story. The 1965 Washington quarter was born during a period when America was trying to solve a very real problem. Silver was becoming more expensive. Coins were in short supply. The mint was under pressure, and the familiar silver quarter was about to disappear from everyday American life. Millions of Americans carried those new clad quarters without realizing that they were holding a piece of history. Today, more than half a century later, those same coins can still turn up in collections, inherited boxes, old jars, and forgotten drawers. Most will be ordinary. Some will be better preserved. A small number may have characteristics that deserve serious attention. And that's what makes the hunt worthwhile. You don't need to believe every unbelievable coin story on the internet. You don't need to assume every old quarter is a jackpot. You simply need to look carefully. Because the next time you see 1965 on a Washington quarter, remember what that date really represents. It isn't just a number stamped into metal. It marks the moment when the everyday American quarter began its journey from silver to clad coinage, and that change would shape the coins Americans carried for generations. This is HF Coins World, where ordinary American coins become little pieces of history. If you enjoy real coin stories without the hype, subscribe to the channel and keep an eye on your own change. Check the dates, study the details, and give those old coins a second look. Because sometimes, the most interesting discovery isn't a fortune sitting in your pocket. It's a story that has been waiting there for more than 60 years. Imagine heavy demand for coins, and people holding on to older silver pieces created enormous pressure on the U.S. Mint. The Coinage Act of 1965 brought a major change, replacing the traditional silver composition of circulating quarters with copper-nickel-clad construction. Suddenly, the familiar quarter Americans had carried for decades was entering a new era. But the problems didn't disappear overnight. The mint needed to produce huge quantities of coins, and during this unusual period, mint marks were removed from circulating issues to help discourage people from hoarding coins based on their place of manufacture. That's why the regular 1967 quarter doesn't carry the familiar D or S you might expect. The missing mint mark is actually part of the history. Now imagine someone finding one today in an old family collection. Maybe it's sitting inside a small envelope that hasn't been opened for decades. The owner sees 1967, turns the coin over, notices there is no mint mark, and starts wondering whether something valuable has been discovered. This is where a smart collector slows down. The date alone does not make the coin rare, and an ordinary circulated 1967 quarter isn't automatically worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. What matters is the individual coin, its condition, strike, surfaces, possible varieties, and whether it contains a genuine mint-made error or belongs to a special issue. In fact, the U.S. Mint also produced 1967 special mint set coins, commonly called SMS coins. And some examples have characteristics that distinguish them from normal circulation strike. But don't assume that every shiny 1967 quarter is an SMS coin. Lighting, handling, and preservation can make an ordinary coin look impressive. So identification needs to be based on the coin's actual characteristics. This is one of the fascinating things about collecting. Two coins with exactly the same date can have completely different collector appeal. One 1967 quarter may be heavily worn, scratched, and circulated, while another may have unusually strong details and very few marks. The second coin can attract much more attention because finding an older coin in exceptional condition can be difficult. And if you notice something strange on your quarter, don't immediately call it a rare error. Genuine mint error happens during production, while scratches, dents, discoloration, and other damage can happen after a coin leaves the mint. Under bright light, ordinary damage can sometimes look dramatic, which is why experienced collectors compare unusual coins with reliable references before reaching a conclusion. A genuine mint error happens during production, while scratches, dents, discoloration, and other damage can happen after a coin leaves the mint. Under bright light, ordinary damage can sometimes look dramatic, which is why experienced collectors compare unusual coins with reliable references before reaching a conclusion. There is another important rule. Never clean a potentially collectible coin just to make it shine. Scrubbing, polishing, or using chemicals can change the original surface and potentially reduce collector desirability. Instead, hold the coin carefully by its edges. Use good lighting and examine the date, lettering, rim, portrait, reverse, and overall surfaces. When it comes to value, be especially careful with online claims. A huge asking price on an internet listing does not prove that someone actually paid that amount. And the sale price of an exceptional certified specimen does not mean every 1967 quarter is worth the same. Most ordinary circulated examples have modest value, while stronger premiums can occur for genuinely exceptional condition, recognized varieties, authentic errors, or special issues. The real market depends on grade, rarity, certification, collector demand, and the specific characteristics of the coin. That's why the best collectors don't start by asking, how much money is this? They start by asking, what exactly do I have? And that question can lead to a much more interesting discovery. Think about the journey of a 1967 quarter. It could have left the mint during a national coin shortage, traveled through a bank, passed across a store counter, disappeared into someone's pocket, spent years in circulation, and eventually ended up in a collection. Millions of Americans used these coins without realizing they were carrying a small piece of a major transition in U.S. monetary history. That is what makes the 1967 Washington quarter fascinating, not because every example is rare, but because it represents a very specific moment when America was changing the way its everyday money was made. So if you have a 1967 Washington quarter, don't dismiss it, but don't believe every exaggerated value claim either. Check the date. Remember that the missing mint mark is normal for the regular issue. Examine the condition. Look for legitimate varieties or mint-made characteristics. And never clean the coin before you know what you have. You might discover something genuinely interesting, or you might simply end up holding an ordinary quarter with an extraordinary story behind it. And honestly, that's one of the reasons coin collecting is so much fun. Here at HF Coins World, we don't need to promise a fortune to make an old coin. We just need to uncover the real history hiding inside it. So before you spend your next old Washington quarter, take a second look, check the date, study the details, and ask yourself one simple question. What was happening in America when this coin was made? If you enjoy discovering the true stories behind American coins, subscribe to HF Coins World. Keep checking your change. And remember, the next interesting coin might already be sitting in your pocket. Imagine finding a Washington quarter in an old jar, looking at the date and realizing it says 1987. At first, you might laugh and think, that coin isn't old enough to matter. But wait, before you spend it, take a closer look. Because the 1987 Washington quarter comes from an interesting chapter in American coin history. And its real collector appeal isn't simply about age or a dramatic internet price. The story begins with a quarter that millions of Americans used every day, carrying it through grocery stores, vending machines, parking meters, gas stations, and cash registers without giving it a second thought. By 1987, the Washington quarter had already been part of American life more than 5 decades, and the familiar design had become one of the most recognizable pieces of U.S. pocket change. Unlike the silver quarters of earlier generations, the 1987 quarter was made with a copper nickel clad composition that had become standard after the major coinage changes of the 1960s. That means the 1987 date does not automatically make a quarter rare, and most ordinary circulated examples are worth around their face value or only a modest premium, depending on condition. But here's where the story gets interesting. Collectors often care less about how many decades old a coin is and more about how well it survived. Think about what happens to a quarter after it leaves the mint. It gets thrown into pockets with keys, mixed with other coins, dropped onto counters, pushed through machines, and handled thousands of times. By the time decades pass, many examples show scratches, contact marks, dull surfaces, and wear. So when a 1987 quarter survives with unusually strong details and very little evidence of circulation, it can attract a completely different level of attention. Now imagine you're sorting through an old collection and find 3 1987 quarters side by side. The first is dark and heavily worn. The second has normal circulation marks. The third looks remarkably sharp, almost as though it spent most of its life protected from everyday use. All 3 carry the same date, but a collector may not see them as equal. That's the psychology of modern coin collecting. The date tells you when the coin was made, but the condition tells you how the coin survived. And there is another detail you should check: the mint mark. Depending on the individual issue, a 1987 Washington quarter can have a P or D mint mark, identifying Philadelphia or Denver production. If you're examining one, look near Washington's neck on the obverse. The mint mark itself doesn't automatically make the coin rare, but it helps you identify exactly what you're holding. This is where beginners sometimes make a mistake. They see a P or D, search the internet, and find a huge price attached to a high-grade example. Then they assume their worn quarter must have the same value. That's not how the market works. A record price for an exceptional certified coin is not a guarantee for an ordinary coin from the same year. Grade, preservation, strike quality, variety, error status, certification, and buyer demand can all affect the final market price. And if your 1987 quarter has something strange on it, slow down before calling it a rare error. A genuine mint-made error occurs during production, while a scratch, dent, discoloration, or other mark can happen years later in circulation. Under a phone camera or bright light, normal damage can look surprisingly dramatic. That's why a responsible collector compares unusual characteristics with trusted references rather than immediately believing the biggest claim online. There's also one simple rule that can protect your coin. Don't clean it. If the quarter looks dirty or dull, resist the temptation to polish it or use chemicals. Cleaning can alter the original surface and reduce collector appeal. Handle the coin by its edges. Place it under good lighting and examine the date, mint mark, lettering, rim, portrait, and reverse details without changing the surface. Now, here's a fascinating part of the 1987 story that often gets overlooked. These quarters weren't created to become collectibles. They were made to be used. Someone in 1987 might have spent one on a newspaper, used it in a vending machine, received it as change at a store, or dropped it into a parking meter. The person who first handled that quarter probably had no idea that decades later, someone would be sitting at a table with a magnifying glass asking whether it had survived unusually well. That's what gives ordinary coins their character. They are small objects that quietly traveled through people's lives. And when one survives in exceptional condition, collectors become interested not just because of its age, but because of its survival story. If you're checking a 1987 Washington quarter today, start with the basics. Confirm the date. Find the mint mark. Examine the surface under good light. Look at the high points of Washington's portrait and the reverse design for wear. Check whether unusual marks appear raised, recessed, or simply scratched into the surface. Compare the coin with reliable references. And if it appears genuinely significant, professional authentication or grading may be worth considering. But keep your expectations realistic. Most 1987 Washington quarters are not hidden fortunes. The exciting possibilities are concentrated in specific circumstances, such as exceptionally high grades, recognized varieties, or authentic mint errors. Even then, the actual selling price depends on the market and the specific coin. That's why the best collectors don't start with the question, how much money will this make me? They start with, what exactly is this coin? That mindset changes everything. Maybe your 1987 quarter turns out to be completely ordinary. That's fine. Maybe it has beautiful preservation. Maybe you notice a legitimate variety. Maybe you discover a characteristic you had never seen before. Either way, you have turned a simple piece of pocket change into a little investigation into American history. And that is exactly why the 1987 Washington quarter deserves a second look. It isn't famous because every example is rare. It's interesting because it represents everyday America in the late 1980s and shows how familiar design continued to move through millions of hands. More than 30 years later, some of those coins are still sitting in drawers, collections, old jars, and forgotten envelopes. So before you spend your next 1987 Washington quarter, pause for a moment, check the date, inspect the mint mark, study the condition, and look for anything genuinely unusual. Don't trust exaggerated promises. Don't clean the coin. And don't assume that an online asking price is the same as real market value. The real thrill is in finding out what you actually have. This is HFF Coins World, where ordinary American coins can reveal extraordinary stories. If you enjoy honest coin discoveries, subscribe to the channel. Keep checking your change, and remember, the next interesting coin may not be hiding in a treasure chest. It may already be sitting in your pocket. Imagine opening an old coin jar and finding a Washington quarter dated 1993. Looks ordinary, familiar, almost too recent to be interesting, and you might be tempted to spend it without another thought. But hold on for just a moment, because the 1993 Washington quarter comes from a fascinating period in American everyday life, and there are details on these coins that collectors know are worth checking before making any judgment about value. The first thing to understand is that 1993 was not a silver quarter year. By this time, circulating Washington quarters had been made with copper-nickel-clad construction for decades. The silver era had ended with the major coinage changes of the 1960s. So a normal 1993 quarter should not be treated as an old silver coin simply because it has been sitting in a drawer for 30 years. But that doesn't make it meaningless. In fact, the story of the 1993 quarter is really a story about survival. Think about where a quarter could have traveled after leaving the U.S. Mint in 1993. It might have gone through a bank, into a cash register, across a grocery store counter, into a vending machine, and then into someone's pocket. It could have been carried in a car, dropped into a jar, forgotten in a drawer, and eventually discovered decades later. The person who first received that quarter probably never imagined that someone in the future would hold it under a bright light and inspect every little detail. And that's where the collector's mindset begins. Instead of asking only, how old is this coin? Collectors ask, how did this particular coin survive? A 1993 quarter that spent years circulating can show scratches, contact marks, dull surfaces, and wear, while another example from the same year may have been protected almost immediately and survived in much stronger condition. Those two coins can have very different collector appeal. Now look at the front of your coin. Washington's portrait is familiar, but around the lower right area near his neck, you should find the mint mark, depending on the issue. A P indicates Philadelphia production, while a D indicates Denver production. The mint mark by itself does not make a 1993 quarter rare, but it helps identify exactly which coin you're examining. And here's something many beginners get wrong. Finding a mint mark doesn't mean you found a valuable coin. Just as finding no unusual mark doesn't mean the coin has no collector interest. The entire coin matters. Look at the date, mint mark, surfaces, rim, lettering, and overall strike. If the coin appears unusually sharp, with strong details and very few contact marks, that's when it may deserve closer attention. The reason condition matters so much is simple. These coins were made to circulate, not to sit safely inside collections. Every trip through a cash register or pocket created another opportunity for the surface to pick up damage. Finding a modern era quarter in truly exceptional preservation can therefore be much more interesting than simply finding an older coin with heavy wear. Now imagine a realistic discovery. Someone is cleaning out a family home and comes across a small box of change saved sometime in the 1990s. Inside are several Washington quarters. Most look exactly like pocket change, but one 1993 quarter has a noticeably cleaner surface and stronger detail. The owner becomes curious and searches online. Suddenly, they see spectacular prices attached to certain 1993 quarters. This is the moment when excitement can easily turn into confusion. A high price shown online may belong to a coin in an exceptional certified grade, a particular variety, or a genuine mint error. It does not mean every 1993 quarter is worth the same amount. An asking price is also not the same thing as a confirmed sale. The real market value depends on the specific coin, its grade, preservation, rarity, certification, and what collectors are actually willing to pay. So if your 1993 quarter is heavily circulated, don't expect a huge windfall simply because you found the date. Most ordinary examples are common and have modest value. The interesting possibilities are usually connected to exceptional condition, recognized varieties, or genuine mint-made errors. And if you notice something strange, don't immediately call it an error. A real mint error occurs during production, while a scratch, dent, discoloration, or other damage can happen after the coin leaves the mint. Sometimes a damaged coin can look incredibly unusual under bright lighting, especially in a close-up photograph. That's why careful collectors compare unusual features with trusted references before reaching a conclusion. There is another simple rule that can protect your coin. Don't clean it. If your 1993 quarter looks dark or dirty, resist the temptation to polish it, scrub it, or use chemicals. Altering the original surface can reduce collector appeal. Instead, hold it by the edges. Place it under good lighting and inspect it exactly as you found it. Now, here's the surprising part about coins from the 1990s. They may feel recent to us, but the earliest 1993 quarters are already more than 3 decades old. That doesn't make them rare, but it does mean that preservation becomes increasingly interesting as time passes. Millions of coins may have been produced, yet far fewer may remain in unusually high condition after years of ordinary handling. This is why collectors can become fascinated with coins that most people would simply spend. They're not necessarily chasing age, they're chasing the combination of history, condition, scarcity, and discovery. For collectors in the United States, Washington quarters are especially accessible because they have been part of everyday American commerce for generations. You don't need to buy an expensive collection to begin searching. You can start with the coins already sitting in your house. Maybe you'll find nothing unusual. Maybe you'll find a beautifully preserved example. Maybe you'll notice a characteristic you've never seen before. And even if the coin turns out to be worth only its face value, you've still discovered something about the journey of American money. That's the real appeal of the 1993 Washington quarter. It isn't a guaranteed treasure, and it shouldn't be presented as one. Its value comes from what the individual coin actually is. So if you find a 1993 quarter, check the date, identify the mint mark, examine the condition, study the surfaces, and be skeptical of exaggerated price claims. Don't clean it, don't assume every unusual mark is an error, and don't confuse an online asking price with a confirmed market value. Instead, ask the question experienced collectors ask: what makes this particular coin different? That question can turn an ordinary quarter into an interesting little investigation. And maybe that's why these coins are worth looking at. A 1993 Washington quarter could have spent decades passing silently through American life before ending up in your hand. You may never know exactly where it traveled, but the coin itself is a small survivor from another era. This is HF Coins World, where we look beyond the face value and uncover the real stories hidden inside American coins. If you enjoy honest coin discoveries, subscribe to the channel. Check the old coins in your drawers and jars, and take a second look before spending them. Because sometimes the coin that seems too ordinary to matter is the one that makes you stop and ask, what story has this little quarter been carrying for more than 30 years?